The C-130 is a turboprop cargo plane in a jet age. It's a relic. That assessment circulated through Pentagon procurement circles throughout the 1970s, a period when supersonic fighters and nuclear-tipped missiles consumed defense budgets. The phrase trash hauler stuck to the Hercules like hydraulic fluid on a crew chief's coveralls, a dismissal repeated so often it became shorthand for anything slow, unglamorous, propeller-driven. By 1980, Lockheed's workhorse had been flying for 24 years. The airframe was older than most of the enlisted personnel loading its cargo bay. Defense analysts pointed to its 366-knot cruise speed, barely half what a commercial 747 could manage, as evidence the platform had outlived its relevance. Then, 52 American hostages got taken in Tehran, and suddenly the United States needed an aircraft that could do something no jet on Earth was capable of doing. Land inside a space roughly the size of a soccer field, collect a group of civilians, and take off again before Iranian Revolutionary Guards could respond. The Pentagon didn't reach for an F-15 or a B-52. Not even the prototype stealth aircraft still hiding in the Nevada desert got a look. They reached for the trash hauler. The program was designated Operation Credible Sport, and its requirements read like engineering fiction. A C-130, gross weight around 155,000 pounds, fully loaded, would need to decelerate from approach speed to a full stop in under 300 feet. For context, a standard Hercules assault landing on a prepared strip uses roughly 1,500 feet. The target was Amjadieh Stadium in central Tehran, a venue measuring approximately 400 feet long by 250 feet wide, margins measured in single digits of feet on each wingtip. The aircraft would then need to lift off vertically or near vertically from that same confined space, clearing the stadium walls with passengers aboard. Colonel Robert Gruny, who managed special operations airlift programs during this period, later reflected on the selection logic in terms captured by Air Force historical accounts. The C-130's cargo volume, structural over-engineering, wide landing gear stance, and tolerance for field modifications made it the only viable candidate. No other airframe in the American inventory combined the payload capacity to carry 52-plus hostages with the structural robustness to absorb what engineers planned to bolt onto it. The Hercules had been designed by Lockheed's Kelly Johnson-era team, with margins that bordered on agricultural, redundant hydraulics paired with wing spars thick enough to seem overbuilt, and a fuselage designed to absorb punishment on unimproved strips from the Arctic to the Mekong Delta. 3 airframes were pulled from active inventory in the fall of 1980. Their tail numbers, 74-1683, 74-1686, and 74-2065. Within weeks, teams at Wagner Aircraft in Texas and Lockheed's Marietta facility began stripping them down for a modification program so classified that even the flight crews initially received only partial briefings on what the finished aircraft was supposed to do. The timeline was measured in weeks, not years. The hostages had already been captive for nearly a year. The specification that produced the Hercules was written in 1951, and it asked for something the Air Force didn't yet know it needed for the next 7 decades. General Tactical Air Command issued a requirement for a turboprop-powered medium transport capable of hauling 90 troops or 30,000 pounds of cargo from short, unprepared airstrips. 4 companies submitted proposals. Boeing offered a scaled-down version of existing jet transport concepts. Fairchild pitched a high-wing design with conventional piston engines. Douglas played it safe with an evolutionary upgrade to the C-124 Globemaster. Lockheed's Georgia division, under Chief Engineer Willis Hawkins, did something different. They started with the cargo floor. It was the kind of choice that left fingerprints on every drawing that followed. Hawkins and his team designed the aircraft from the inside out, beginning with a cargo bay, 41 feet long, 9 feet wide, and 9 feet tall, dimensions driven not by aerodynamic elegance, but by the physical size of a standard Army truck, or a 105mm howitzer with its towing vehicle. The fuselage cross-section was essentially a squared-off, rectangle with just enough rounding to manage airflow. riding on a high wing that kept the four Allison T-56 turboprops and their 13.5-foot Hamilton standard propellers well above the debris line on unprepared strips. The rear of the fuselage hinged open into an integral loading ramp that could be lowered in flight. In 1951, that feature alone bordered on radical for a fixed-wing transport. The Air Force picked Lockheed's proposal on July 2, 1951. The prototype YC-13 flew on August 23, 1954, out of Burbank, California, the only Hercules ever built there, because Lockheed quickly realized the production run would need the larger Marietta, Georgia facility. By 1957, C-130As were entering squadron service, and almost immediately, the criticism started. Turboprops in 1957 looked like a technological dead end. The Boeing 707 had just flown. The B-52 was entering service. The Air Force was funding Mach 2 interceptors and planning for Mach 3 bombers. A four-engine propeller transport with a cruise speed under 370 knots seemed like something left over from the previous war. Lockheed's own Skunk Works, operating in the same corporate structure, was building the U-2 and laying groundwork for what would become the SR-71. The Georgia team's lumbering cargo hauler didn't generate cocktail party conversation in the same way. What the critics missed was a concept that wouldn't get its own buzzword for another 40 years: modularity. The Hercules airframe turned out to be less a finished product than a starting point. The fuselage was cavernous, the wing structure was easy to get at, the electrical system generated 40 kilovolt amperes per engine, and the hydraulics ran at 3,000 pounds per square inch, all of which gave modification teams room to work. The Navy hung ski gear on it for Antarctic operations. The Marine Corps tested it as an assault carrier off the USS Forrestal. Lieutenant James Flatley landed and launched a KC-130F from the carrier deck in October 1963, the heaviest aircraft ever to operate from a ship, a record that still stands. Aerial firefighting variants came next, then gunship conversions, electronic warfare platforms, weather reconnaissance. Every one of them exploited the same surplus of space and capacity that Hawkins had built in from the cargo floor up. Willis Hawkins, in an interview published by the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, put it plainly: "We designed it to be a truck." The word was deliberate. A truck gets modified, overloaded, driven on roads it was never meant for, and it keeps running. By 1980, the C-130 had been in continuous production for 26 years across 6 major variants, with over 1,200 airframes delivered. The jets that were supposed to replace it had come and gone. The C-141 handled the strategic role. The C-5 took the outsized cargo mission, but nothing replaced the Hercules in the dirt. Sand was the first problem. Fine-grained calcium powder desert sand suspended in the air column at altitudes nobody had forecast, thick enough to scatter visible light into a milky brownish haze that pilots would later describe as flying inside a bottle of milk. On the night of April 24, 1980, 8 RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters launched from the USS Nimitz into the Iranian desert, bound for a staging site codenamed Desert 1, a flat stretch of hard-packed ground on the Dasht-e-Kavir salt plain, roughly 200 miles southeast of Tehran. The plan called for 6 helicopters minimum to reach the staging point. All 8 launched. Only 5 arrived operational. Helicopter number 6 developed a cracked rotor blade indication 85 miles into the flight. Its crew transferred to helicopter number 8 and turned back. Helicopter number 5 flew into the suspended dust, what meteorologists later identified as a haboob, a phenomenon common in the region but absent from the mission weather briefing, and its crew, disoriented and unable to maintain formation, reversed course to the Nimitz. Helicopter number 2 made it to Desert 1, but arrived with a failed hydraulic pump that rendered it unflyable. The mission commander, Colonel Charles Beckwith of Delta Force, now had 5 working helicopters. He needed 6. At approximately 200 hours local time, Beckwith recommended abort. President Carter, monitoring from the White House Situation Room, concurred. The withdrawal is where the mission became a disaster. During the withdrawal sequence, helicopter number 3 repositioned to refuel from one of the EC-130E tanker aircraft parked on the desert floor. The rotor wash kicked up a wall of dust. The helicopter drifted, its main rotor striking the EC-130's fuselage. Both aircraft erupted. The fireball killed 8 servicemen, 5 Air Force crew in the Hercules, 3 Marines in the helicopter. The survivors evacuated on the remaining C-130s, leaving behind the helicopters, classified documents, and the bodies of their dead. The political fallout cost Carter the presidency. The operational fallout reshaped American Special Operations permanently. The Holloway Commission, formerly the Special Operations Review Group, chaired by Admiral James Holloway III, delivered its report in August 1980 and identified 23 specific issues, from inadequate joint training to the absence of a dedicated Special Operations Command structure. Its recommendations would eventually produce the United States Special Operations Command in 1987, the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, a wholesale rethinking of how the services planned complex missions, and a joint training infrastructure that hadn't existed before. Those reforms took years. The hostages were still in Tehran, and the Carter administration was hemorrhaging credibility with every passing week. Someone inside the Joint Chiefs planning staff, the specific originator remains unidentified in declassified records, proposed a second rescue attempt built around a different concept entirely. Forget the helicopters. Use a fixed-wing aircraft that could fly into Tehran and land where no fixed-wing aircraft was supposed to be able to land. How do you stop 155,000 pounds of aircraft in 300 feet? The engineering answer was blunt. Strap enough rocket motors to the airframe and fire them at exactly the right moment. The modification scheme centered on 30 rocket motors arranged across the airframe in 3 functional groups. 8 Shrike anti-radar missile motors, their warheads removed, their solid fuel propellant retained, were mounted in pairs on the forward fuselage, angled to fire against the direction of flight. These were the braking rockets. Upon touchdown, the pilot would fire them in sequenced pairs, each motor delivering roughly 3,000 pounds of thrust rearward, decelerating the aircraft from approach speed to a dead stop in a distance shorter than most commercial parking lots. The timing window between sequential firings measured in fractions of a second. Fire too early and the aircraft would slam nose down into the ground. Fire too late and it would overrun the stadium boundary at 80 knots. For takeoff, the engineers bolted 8 ASROC anti-submarine rocket motors beneath the wings and along the lower fuselage, oriented to provide vertical and forward thrust simultaneously. These would supplement the 4 T-56 turboprops during the takeoff roll, effectively launching a cargo plane off the ground like an overweight bottle rocket. The remaining 14 motors, a mix of smaller JATO bottles and additional Shrike units, provided directional control and attitude correction during the critical transition between rocket-assisted flight and conventional aerodynamic lift. They also built in redundancy, extra motors in case individual units failed to ignite. The entire rocket package was controlled through a custom fire control sequencer that Lockheed's Marietta team built in under 6 weeks. Each motor had to fire in precise order, at precise intervals, with the pilot managing throttles on 4 turboprops simultaneously. The sequencer was analog. No digital flight computers governed the firing chain. A rotary switch on the instrument panel armed each group independently. The crew would be flying a cargo transport strapped to enough solid rocket propellant to register on seismic equipment, governed by switches and relays that belonged in a 1960s missile silo. Flight testing began at Wagner Field near Fort Worth, Texas, in October 1980. The first aircraft designated for live rocket trials was 74-1683. Its crew had been practicing approaches into a stadium-sized box marked on the runway with orange cones. The orange cones sat 400 feet apart on the Wagner Field runway, roughly the interior dimensions of Amjadieh Stadium in central Tehran, minus a safety margin. The first live rocket landing test on 74-1683 worked. The aircraft touched down, the forward-firing Shrike motors ignited in sequence, and the Hercules stopped in under 350 feet. Subsequent tests pushed the performance further. By mid-October 1980, the crew had demonstrated repeatable landings inside a 300-foot box and rocket-assisted takeoffs that cleared a 50-foot obstacle in comparable distance. A cargo plane weighing more than 150,000 pounds was doing what fighter jocks would call a carrier landing. On dirt, at night, without a tailhook or arresting wire. The operational plan called for the modified C-130 to fly into Tehran at low altitude under cover of darkness, land inside the stadium adjacent to the embassy compound, load the rescued hostages while Delta operators held the perimeter, then launch back out using the ASROC takeoff rockets. Total time on the ground, under 15 minutes. The stadium's dimensions, roughly 400 by 600 feet of usable surface, had been confirmed through satellite imagery and CIA ground reconnaissance. Power lines along the northern boundary would need to be cut by a special operations team inserted ahead of the aircraft. The plan was aggressive to the point of absurdity. The flight test data said it was physically possible. Then 74-1683 reached its airframe stress limits from repeated rocket firings, and the program rotated to the second modified aircraft, 74-1686. On October 29, 1980, during a full-profile landing demonstration at the Duke Field Auxiliary Runway near Eglin Air Force Base, the braking rockets fired out of sequence. The dorsal set ignited while the aircraft was still approximately 20 feet above the runway surface. Without the expected ground contact to absorb the deceleration force, the asymmetric thrust pitched the nose down violently. The Hercules struck the ground hard, collapsed its landing gear, and broke apart in a fuel-fed fire that consumed the airframe. The crew escaped. All 5 men got out, some with injuries, none fatal. Film footage of the crash, declassified years later, shows the aircraft dropping like a stone once the premature rocket firing killed its forward momentum. The sequencer had functioned correctly on every previous test. The investigation pointed to a wiring fault in the dorsal rocket circuit, though the classified accident report has never been released in full. Sources within the program, cited in James Kyle's 1990 account The Guts to Try, indicated the firing anomaly traced to a single connection in the analog sequencer, a single wire, a missed signal, and 1 aircraft destroyed. A third airframe, 74-1687, was already undergoing modification at Marietta when 74-1686 burned. The program was not dead. Lockheed engineers were incorporating lessons from the crash into the backup aircraft's rocket sequencer, adding redundant firing circuits and a manual override capability. The timeline was tight but technically feasible for a spring 1981 mission window. Iran's negotiating posture shifted after Ronald Reagan won the November 1980 presidential election. By mid-January 1981, the Algiers Accords were taking shape. On January 20th, 1981, Inauguration Day, the 52 American hostages boarded an Algerian aircraft at Mehrabad Airport. They were airborne before Reagan finished his oath of office. Operation Credible Sport went into the classified files. Aircraft 74-1687, its rocket mounts partially installed, was quietly returned to standard C-130 configuration. Willis Hawkins, the Lockheed engineer who led the original C-130 design team in 1951, told an interviewer in 2001 that the airframe was designed to last 20 years. By the time he said that, the youngest C-130A in service was already 42. The oldest E-model was pushing 40 and flying hurricane reconnaissance missions into the eye walls of Category 4 storms. Turbulence, slamming the airframe hard enough to rattle fillings loose from the flight engineer's teeth. Rain so dense against the windscreen, it sounded like gravel hitting sheet metal. The aircraft kept flying, and the design split into new forms nobody had anticipated. The variant list stopped resembling an aircraft family sometime around the 15th subtype. It looks more like a military-industrial phylum. The AC-130 gunship mounts a 105mm howitzer, an artillery piece, a weapon designed to level buildings, firing sideways out of a cargo plane in a left-hand pylon turn at 150 knots. The MC-130 Combat Talon carries terrain-following radar that lets it fly at 250 feet above ground level in total darkness, threading mountain valleys to insert special operations teams behind enemy lines. The KC-130 refuels helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft in flight, trailing a drogue basket from each wing while simultaneously hauling 12,000 pounds of cargo in its hold. The EC-130H Compass call jams enemy communications and air defense networks. The EC-130OJ Commando Solo broadcasts radio and television signals into hostile territory. Psychological operations delivered from a propeller-driven airplane circling at 20,000 feet. The LC-130 operated exclusively by the New York Air National Guard's 109th Airlift Wing, lands on ski-equipped gear at Antarctic and Greenland ice stations, where the surface temperature drops below -50 degrees Fahrenheit and hydraulic fluid turns to paste if the engines shut down too long. The WC-130OJ Hurricane Hunter penetrates tropical cyclones at 10,000 feet, releasing dropsondes into the storm's core while flying through updrafts violent enough to throw unsecured equipment across the cargo bay. 70-plus variants across 4 major production models, A through J, built in 70 countries' inventories, with more than 2,600 airframes delivered since 1956. Lockheed Martin's Marietta production line has been building C-130s continuously for longer than most aerospace companies have existed. The J model, currently in production, shares its basic wing platform and fuselage cross-section with the A model that Willis Hawkins sketched on a drafting table during the Korean War. The engines are different, and the avionics occupy a different century entirely. But the fundamental geometry, that high wing, that rear ramp, that cavernous rectangular cargo hold, that basic promise of a flying box truck, remains essentially unchanged because nobody has found a reason to change it. I think that's the most damning indictment of every aircraft that tried to replace the Hercules. Replacements kept arriving. The Hercules absorbed their missions instead. What does a propeller-driven cargo plane do when an F-15E Strike Eagle goes down inside Iranian airspace? It flies in after them, the same airframe, the same mission profile. 44 years later, into the same country. Details remain sparse because most of the operational specifics are still classified at the compartmented level. What has emerged through Air Force Special Operations, command reporting, and congressional testimony in 2024 confirms the broad strokes. MC-130OJ Commando 2 aircraft. The J model Hercules, direct linear descendant of the airframe Willis Hawkins, designed in 1951, conducted clandestine forward arming and refueling point operations inside Iranian territory during heightened tensions between 2023 and 2025. The mission? Establish covert fuel and recovery nodes deep enough inside Iran to support combat search and rescue for downed coalition air crews. AFSOC crews flew the missions at low altitude, at night, using terrain-following radar and passive sensors to thread Iranian air defense coverage zones that had grown considerably more sophisticated since 1980. The aircraft landed on unimproved strips, offloaded fuel bladders and personnel, then extracted before dawn. Some of these strips were less than 3,000 feet long. Standard C-130 territory. The Hercules didn't need rockets this time, just the same short-field performance that had been baked into the airframe since the original specification. In 1980, the United States tried to fly a rocket-modified C-130 into a Tehran soccer stadium because no other aircraft could do the job. The mission never launched. The hostages came home through diplomacy, and Operation Credible Sport became a classified footnote. 4 decades on, when American strike aircraft began flying combat missions that put them within range of Iranian air defenses, the contingency plan for recovering downed crews relied on the same airplane. Different model, different avionics. But the same wing, same ramp, same rectangular cargo hold, same landing gear touching down on the same kind of hostile dirt. A FSOC's commander, Lieutenant General Tony Bauernfeind, told the Senate Armed Services Committee in March 2024 that Special Operations Aviation Forces had established persistent forward presence in contested environments that would have been considered inaccessible a generation earlier. He did not name Iran specifically in open session. The classified annex, according to reporting by Air Force magazine, contained operational details that several committee members described as striking. The F-15E crews flying strike packages over the region carried something their predecessors at Desert One never had: the certainty that if they went down, a Hercules would come for them. A turboprop cargo plane, subsonic and unarmed in the transport configuration, with no escort, flying into one of the most heavily defended airspaces on Earth. The trash hauler, doing what the fast movers couldn't. In January 2025, Lockheed Martin delivered the 600th C-13OJ Super Hercules from the same Marietta, Georgia, production facility that built the first A model in 1955. The line has been running for 70 years. No other military aircraft production run in Western history comes close. The F-16 reached roughly 4,600 airframes across multiple countries, but its line has fractured across continents and contractors. The Hercules still rolls out of one building, in one Georgia town, assembled by a workforce that includes third-generation Lockheed employees whose grandparents riveted the wing spars on A models bound for Vietnam. The C-13OJ that comes off the line today would be unrecognizable in its cockpit to a 1956-era crew. 2 pilots, no navigator, no flight engineer. The glass cockpit and digital mission computers eliminated 2 crew positions entirely. The Rolls-Royce AE 2100D3 turboprops generate 4,637 shaft horsepower each, a 29% increase over the H model's T56 engines, turning 6-bladed Dowdy R391 composite propellers that are visually the most obvious difference from earlier variants. Maximum speed is 362 knots. Range extends beyond 2,000 nautical miles with a full combat load. The aircraft can also back up on the ground under its own power, which matters more than it sounds like it should on austere strips with no ground equipment and no room to turn around. More than 60 nations operate the Hercules in some form. The type has been in continuous combat somewhere on Earth since 1958. Lockheed Martin's current order backlog for the J model stretches past 2030, with active production contracts from the United States, France, Germany, Israel, New Zealand, and Indonesia, among others. The company's 2024 annual report listed the C-13OJ program as generating approximately $2.8 billion in annual revenue. For an obsolete propeller plane, the margins look healthy. Every jet transport that was supposed to replace it is either retired or canceled. The survivors serve in different roles. The C-141 Starlifter flew its last mission in 2006. The Advanced Medium STOL transport program died in committee. The C-17, Globemaster III, a far larger, far more expensive aircraft, never went after the dirt strip tactical mission because Boeing understood what Lockheed had proven decades earlier. That job was taken. The 1951 specification asked for a turboprop that could haul 30,000 pounds out of a short, unprepared field. The current J model hauls 42,000 pounds out of a shorter one. 70 years of production, 2,600 plus airframes delivered, 70 variants, 60 operators, and the Marietta line is still open. The trash hauler is still flying.